Greetings, Dr. Mark Winton here, and I'd like to continue our discussion by focusing on profiling political leaders, and additionally, I'd like to go ahead and focus some of our attention on the research on the Nazi doctors. But first, let me back up for a moment and mention that these are not cases found in your textbook, but some special cases I'm bringing in addition. Basically, in looking at profiling political leaders, and I'm not going to focus on any specific cases, but I will refer you to the excellent work of Professor Post. And I pulled this from his article, Assessing Leaders at a Distance, the Political Personality Profile, which I read and found in his edited book, The Psychological Assessment of Political Leaders, from the University of Michigan Press. Just just a superb work. And again, I think this is very relevant too. And when we get into profiling political leaders, again, you can imagine, just political. There's that term, politics, political, and profiling political leaders is very political. So I'm not going to do it. I'll let you be the judge, the jury, the profiler, the scientist, etc. I just want to give you some of the methodologies and ideas behind this. There certainly have been some excellent political profiles, though, of not only, for example, American presidents, but also of other leaders from other countries, both those that have helped countries achieve greatness and those that have destroyed countries. So Post looks at this whole idea of creating a psychological biography within the particular nation of interest. So some of the things you want to start thinking about and looking at is the culture of that country, the history of the nation, the family background of the leader, his or her education and leadership experiences and career. And then you want to begin to move into personality factors. Think about their appearance and health, their intelligence, their levels of emotional responses, what seems to drive them, their relationships with others, their motivation, and also their reality testing. Basically, are they in touch with reality? Or do they have some major mental disorders? That's very relevant as well. And of course, it's very difficult to judge mental disorders from a distance without actually, doing a clinical interview. In fact, it's unethical for a mental health professional to make a diagnosis on someone who they actually haven't had a chance to examine and conduct a thorough, assessment. So beware of those people on television who see a few minutes of a clip of a case and then all of a sudden have all these diagnostic categories. No, that's not ethical, and that's inappropriate, and often it's very faulty. We also want to look at the worldview, the political view of the person, their core beliefs and their ideology. What do they believe? How do they believe the world should operate? What do they believe is good, moral? What do they believe makes sense? How is that related to their nationalism and their ties and their cohesion to their group and their country? And what kind of leadership style do they have? How do they view their role? How do they enact their carry out those expectations that go along with their role? How do they interact with others? What about their speaking skills? What do they say? What are their goals, or how do they react to stressors or crisis situations? And what kind of support do they have? We want to look at leaders, but also we want to look at followers. And then finally, we want to try to make predictions, and we want to look at historical cases to try to predict what happened in those cases and try to come up with some models. And that sort of gives us an idea of political profiling, just in a nutshell. Obviously, I would highly recommend reading some of the materials, going to the journals, and looking at psychohistory, psychobiography, sociobiographies, political profiles. And there's many good ones, there's many that are not so good, so you have to learn how to judge the quality of them as well. And there's some that there's an attempt to be as unbiased and objective as possible, and then there's others where there's some kind of bias inherent in the analysis. And I'm not quite sure reading the autobiography of a leader is that helpful, because that's very, very biased. It may be helpful in some ways to get some insight, but you want to go ahead and bring in a lot of other information as well, because usually that's giving the best scenario or trying to present a particular presentation of self in a very positive light. Um, what I do want to mention next is a little bit of background on just another amazing study done by Dr. Lifton, a psychiatrist, on the Nazi doctors. The book is actually called The Nazi Doctors, and it was updated, revised, I guess, in 2000 and published by Basic Books by Dr. R.J. Lifton. He has written some other material as well, just amazing stuff, an amazing psychiatrist that provides some very thought-provoking work that I think can be related in some ways to our profiling course and a lot of other interdisciplinary areas as well. He talks about in his book, or he asks the question basically, how did these Nazi physicians become killers? And he actually interviewed 29 Nazi medical practitioners and 12 Nazi non-medical practitioners and 80 Auschwitz prisoners to find out more about what he referred to as this medicalized killing. That he asks, how responsible were the doctors and how did they carry out these medical killings in a way that they were able to identify themselves as healthcare providers or physicians. He finds 5 steps leading to the killings. First, we have coercive sterilization, primarily of those that were considered to have low intelligence or have some type of physical or mental disability. The second step was killing impaired children. The third step was killing impaired adults. The fourth step, killing impaired inmates of concentration camps. And then the fifth stage or step was the mass killings in the extermination camps. So he kind of sees this as a process that evolved over time where the killings developed in a larger scale. He also points out that these physicians had what he called doubling, which is the division of the self into 2 functioning wholes, basically. So these physicians would connect with the concentration camp environment on the one hand, and then they'd connect on another hand, kind of another personality dimension with their family and friends, and keep those separate, kind of have 2 selves, really what he referred to as an Auschwitz self and the other self. And they try to avoid guilt about what they were doing by having some kind of idea that their second self really is committing the crimes. Also, it's very relevant to look at some of the actual medical experiments, and I would highly recommend Vivian Spitz's work, Doctors from Hell, published by Sentient Publications, which goes over some of the transcripts by the author who was a transcriptionist during the Nuremberg trials, and talks about these medical cases, high-altitude freezing experiments, malaria experiments, mustard gas experiments, for example, seawater exposure, sterilization, inducing typhus, injecting poison, and so on, and how this occurred. So I think this is really relevant and important to do, and to ask ourselves. Here's the big question, really, and then we'll wrap things up here, and that's to ask, were these normal physicians at one point, and then they became these basically serial killers, and then after the Holocaust and the war, they went back to practicing medicine for years and years. Okay, what I would ask you to do is to explain that. And I'll even ask, do we have adequate knowledge, information, and theories to put that into some perspective? And really, I have to congratulate Professor Lifton for doing such a superb job of bringing in his one model. And this wraps up this video.